Before we even get to naming different defenses that we're going to see, we teach our quarterback a communication system of the shades that defensive linemen will line up in. Okay, so we call these shades. The way that they're lined up on an offensive player will tell us what their responsibilities are. Okay, so if we take a look, starting with our center, if they are playing one side of the center or the other, we call that lining up in a shade. Okay, if they line up on the inside shoulder of our guard, we call that a one shade. If it's the outside shoulder of the guard, we call it a three shade. If they're inside shade of the tackle, we call it a 4-eye. If he's outside shade of the tackle, we call it a 5. And then with the tight end or a tight slot, if he's inside shade, we would call it a 6-eye. If he's outside shade, it would be a 9. Then we look at head-up positions. Anytime a player is head-up on one of our offensive linemen, we give it an even number. So head-up on a center is 0, head-up on the guard is 2, head-up on the tackle is 4, and head-up on a tight end or a tight slot is 6. If we add linebackers and we talk about their shades, we would just add a 0 to that. So a linebacker at depth that is lined up over top of the guard, we'd say that he's in a 20 shade. Okay, if he's in the gap, we would just call out the gap. So that linebacker is lined up in an A-gap technique. Okay, so this really helps us out with not only our quarterbacks, but anytime our linemen come off the field and we're going to find out where guys are lined up, they can talk us through it, and then we can draw it up and we can diagram it and do any adjustments that we want in terms of blocking scheme. Communication system makes things much easier than a player coming back and saying, hey coach, he was lined up on my shoulder. So this way, if it's a guard, he just has to come back and say, coach, he was lined up in a 3 on me. Early in my career, I often wondered why it was so important to be able to communicate the shades of defensive linemen. And here would be a reason why. Well, there's some defensive linemen that it would be an advantage to run to certain shades, while in other shades it would be an advantage to run away from. So for instance, anybody that would be lined up in a 5 versus our offense would be outside shade of the tackle. We would want to identify them because in our zone read, we will generally read a 5 shade. If somebody is playing a 3, we love running counter and power to the 3 shade. Versus if somebody is in a 1 shade, there's other types of plays that we're going to run towards that as well. Once we start teaching our players how to identify and communicate shades, now we'll start looking at structures of defense. So we take a look at defensive cores. The core is the interior part of the defense that will involve 1, 2, or 3 defensive linemen and 1 or 2 linebackers. So if you take a look at both of these cores that we've drawn up, okay, these are odd structured cores. So in this case we have a defensive lineman that is lined up in a 0 on the center, and we have 2 linebackers that are lined up in a 20, versus the other one where the defensive lineman is lined up in a 0 on the center with a stacked linebacker in behind. Okay, when players are lined up like this, it tells us what their responsibilities are with regards to the A and B gaps. So there's 6 basic cores that you'll see. On the left, this is what we would call an odd core. Odd means center is covered, both guards are uncovered, and there's a linebacker over top of both guards. Okay, on the right, okay, this is a core with 1 defensive lineman as well, and he has a stacked linebacker in behind. So we would consider this core, because both guards are uncovered, okay, linebackers over top of the nose who's on the center, we would consider that an odd stack. So cores with 1 defensive lineman, we'll either call them odd or odd stack. In the second diagram here, we're going to look at cores with 2 defensive linemen. So we're looking at the interior of a defense and how they're structured. Again, who's responsible for the A and B gaps? If we take a look at the diagram on the left, okay, the center doesn't have a D lineman on him. Sometimes he's possibly shaded. So sometimes what you may get is you may get the guard has a player outside shade of him, and then instead of this player being inside shade of the guard, he's lined up shaded on the center. Otherwise, the center is going to be uncovered and both guards wind up being covered by some sort of defensive lineman, okay? And then there's going to be 2 players at linebacker depth, and they're in the B gap to B gap area. Okay, so we would call that core even. Then on the right, okay, the center doesn't have a D lineman on him, or he's possibly shaded, similar to the other one. And now there's only 1 player at linebacker depth, and he's in the B gap to B gap area. So we would call that an even stack. The third structure that we're looking at is anytime all 3 of your interior linemen are covered by defensive linemen, and we would call that a bear. So anytime we get a bear look, we're going to get one of 2 types. On the left, okay, we're going to have the center guard and both guards covered. There's going to be no linebacker in the B gap to B gap areas. They're generally going to be aligned over the tackles and the C gaps in that case, and we would call that bear. Okay, or in the other diagram, all 3 defensive linemen are lined up on top of the center and guards, and there's 1 linebacker at linebacker depth over top of the center, and we call that stack, bear stack. The next thing we do is we try to use the same terminology on both sides of the ball. So now it's all about communicating the fronts in a concise way so that you'll be able to get a description or an image in your head. And so what we do is we label the front. So on top is our odd cores. Anytime we get an odd core, it's going to be one of these 4 types of fronts. So we either get what we call a stealer, and I'm going to show you on the video, a stealer, or we'll get what we call an okie, a bear, or a stack. Okay, then with the even fronts, okay, we're going to get what we would call a rip Liz and a rip Liz. That's 2 linebackers over top of the guards. Or the Miami would be an even stack. And then sometimes we'll go against teams and you'll see that we can't even identify the front. And we can't identify the front initially until we figure it out. We will call it joker, and that tells our guys that the front was non-identifiable. In this diagram here are the various fronts that we'll see that are considered odd cores. So on the top left, this is what we would call a stealer front. A stealer front has an odd core and 2 inside linebackers. The outside linebackers tend to be overhang players. On the top right, we call this an odd stack. In an odd stack, it's the 3-3 stack to us. So you have 3 defensive linemen, and then a right, middle, and left backers. Okay, and then down at the bottom, an okie is very similar to a stealer with the exception of the outside linebackers are walked up and now become more like defensive ends. And these players on top of the tackles, those are more of B-gap players, and they're more like defensive tackles. And then down at the bottom, this is a bear core where the center and guards are covered. The linebackers are over top, responsible for the B to C gap. And then you've got the outside linebackers walked up, and that's a bear front. The main difference between stealer and okie, although they look very similar in terms of the core, in an okie, the outside linebackers have no pass responsibility, and they're more like rush ends. And now the strong and free safety are generally going to be involved in coverage. A lot of times, this will be a pressure defense. Defense is bringing cover 0, and now the 2 safeties are locked up in coverage. Versus a stealer, they're more going to be C-gap run to getting inside and underneath number 2, the curl seam area on pass. The last slide here are even fronts. So these are both even cores on the left and the right. You can see that in an even core, your guards are generally both covered, or one will be covered, and then instead of the other one being covered, he'll shade the center. And then in the case on the left, we call this a rip Liz front, as determined where the 3 shade is. And rip Liz tells us that we've got generally a 1 and a 3 shade, okay, and then a linebacker over top of the guards in 20. And then on the right, we will still have the same structure on the front, but the difference will be there will be now 1 linebacker stacked over top of the center.
Coach is Rich Stewart with allaccesscoaching.com. I really hope this video helps make you a better coach. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button down below so we can let you know when new content becomes available, because we're all about coaches helping coaches. And remember, coach, better today, never as good as tomorrow.